Okay, welcome to Chapter 3, The Crime Picture. We're going to be looking at some data today, and um, I just want to preface this with the idea that we're going to be talking about some terms: objective, subjective. Sometimes you'll hear the term metadata. Um, Data and facts have some overlap, clearly. Um, One of the things that people who study criminal justice tend to focus on is less individually driven data, anecdotal data, like I was robbed, or she was beaten up, or he was scammed. And we really want to focus more on very large sets of data. So we'll say, okay, there were 10,000 murders, or there were 3,000 rapes, or there was 5,000 cases of arson. This is not to say that individual instances are any less valid or worthy of study, because they can lead us to understandings by focusing. So the thing to start with as we begin our examination of the crime picture, this chapter is entitled, is the idea that there's different ways of looking at the data regarding crime. Having said that, let's go ahead and jump into Chapter 3 and see where we stand. Okay, again, we got those learning objectives, and these are going to be present for every chapter. Not critical that you look at them, more what I need to accomplish or want to accomplish. A few questions to ask. Some of these are related directly to what's in your text, but I also think that some of these are important points to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so we're going to start our discussion about the difference between civil and criminal law. Ask yourself why. If I'm starting there, you can fairly ask, well, what is this distinction? Why is this distinction being made? Is this a rational distinction? Should we do this? And if you say it's rational, if it's logical, part of rationality is accepting the universe that exists now. At least that's one way of looking at it. So we can fall into a trap, really, if we go back to some of the early chapters of ethnocentrism. Well, of course there's two types of law, criminal law and civil law, because that's just what I experience. That's what's normal. We're going to talk about the perception of crime. And of course, the perception, how we perceive what's going on, can be different than what the reality is. And I hope to demonstrate to you, at least, that that's certainly true when it comes to criminal justice. So we need to ask the question, why? Why is this happening? Who benefits from a difference in perception? Who suffers from it? And of course, when you're reading this, or when you are doing any sort of study, you're going to have explanations to problems that are posed. Not only should you ask, why are we looking at these problems? But you should ask questions like, why are you focusing on these explanations? Why, to the exclusion of what other ones, and what other ones exist? And are they good and are they bad? Because, there are other explanations for crime that are just, silly. So you might have some conspiracy theorists say, well, lizard people from Andromeda Space Command have landed and they're committing most crimes. Well, that's an alternative explanation. It's a silly one. And it's been excluded from the text for very good reasons, because no data to support it. It's borderline, mentally ill. However, there are others that are much closer, and we'll touch on at least a few of those. Okay, one of the first things we do in the legal system is we classify something as either a civil act or a criminal act, and then we subcategorize it inside there. So obviously this is criminal justice, so we're going to focus on the criminal. Each one of these systems are treated differently. They have their own separate parts inside the greater criminal justice system. They use, for example, different terminologies. They have different goals. They have different outcomes, even, whether the goal is met or not. One of the differences is how we determine and what the result is, the liability issue, we'll say, or the guilty issue. Criminally, if you are convicted of a crime, you are found guilty. That is the name of your sentence. Civilly, if you are found liable, okay, you wind up paying money. So criminally we use the term guilty, civilly we use the term liable. There are different burdens of proof in each of these systems. Criminally, you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt that someone is guilty. Civilly, you need to show a preponderance of the evidence. So you need to show it is right that there is liability by a preponderance of the evidence, which is a little bit close, but not exactly, to saying, okay, you need at least 51% of the evidence to 49, although obviously it's going to be weighted differently. If you have an outstanding piece of DNA evidence and you've got a lot of eyewitness evidence on the other side, you might say, well, there's only 10% of the evidence is DNA and 90% is eyewitnesses. Yeah, but the DNA is so powerful, and eyewitness identification is a subject of such challenge that by preponderance of the evidence, we would say that there's probable liability there. Okay. Felonies, misdemeanors, and infractions. Typically, we break the criminal law up into three large groupings. So first we broke the law up into civil and criminal. Now we're breaking the criminal up into felonies, misdemeanors, and infractions. Your felonies are your serious crimes. And very often states will have different degrees of felonies. So you will hear, for example, first degree, second degree. Some states, third degree. We don't tend to use that in North Carolina. North Carolina will usually see first degree, second degree, and then occasionally you'll see crimes that aren't listed at all. Important crimes, rape, murder, often they have degree. Misdemeanor. Misdemeanors are minor crimes that are divided by degree as well in many states, including North Carolina. So you might have a first degree misdemeanor, a second degree misdemeanor. And then you have your infractions. These are very minor crimes, typically for things like speeding. Usually they're nonviolent. Usually they call for the issuing of a ticket or the paying of a fine. Mala in se and mala prohibita. Now this is, I guess, one of the places, excuse me, that we're going to start using Latin, and the law is really shot through with Latin. So it seems at first it's a pretty simple division. Mala in se basically means the act is evil. Mala prohibita means, well, there's not an evil component to it, but it's against the law. So a quick example would be murdering someone. That's a mala in se act. Speeding, well, that's a mala prohibita. But this can get a little bit blurred. If you think about, say, drinking or drugs, you might say, well, drinking, underage drinking, that's a mala prohibita. We have just decided to prohibit that. But if I told you that drunk driving leads to thousands of deaths every year, you would say, well, to kill someone where you're in this state, that's an evil act. So maybe drinking is mala in se. So these lines can be blurred very easily. And sometimes the damage or the evil is not necessarily present in the act itself, but present in things that are associated with it. So you might say, well, prostitution is a victimless crime, is a mala prohibita act, because people are consenting to it. On the other hand, think of the damage that it could do to people, to families, to individuals. Think of underage women being more easily, underage women and men, being more easily lured into the field because there would be legality. So you can talk about individual lack of harm or evilness, and it might have a greater social problem. All right. Measuring crime in the United States. Now, data is an objective piece of information. Objective usually means, in a sort of sense, we can easily determine its truth. It recognized as true. So, simplest way, 1 + 1 = 2. If you're going to talk about crime, and if you're going to say crime is up, crime is down, crime occurred, crime didn't, let's have real numbers. Now, you can have, as I said, anecdotal evidence, individual evidence, like I was robbed. But as I said, we really prefer larger data sets. So we would like, for example, to know how many people in North Carolina last year were murdered versus how many 10 years ago versus how many people 40 years ago, and what the trends are. The big game in town here is what's called the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report. Now, this is something that criminologists and people who study criminal justice love, and we love it because it really is the first time in human history where you begin to get very comprehensive numbers about crime that you can start to trust. So, starting in the 1930s, the FBI began to go around to the police departments of the United States and said, okay, Raleigh, send us your numbers on crime. Tell us what crimes occurred. Tell us how they were cleared. And they went to sheriff's departments, they went to police departments, went to the state police, or the highway patrol, and they publish these numbers yearly. Now they break them down into Part 1 offenses, which are your more serious crimes, and your Part 2 offenses. Then they also do some interesting thing. Not only do they give you the raw numbers, so they might say, okay, in the United States, and I'm making this number up, there were 10,000 murders last year. They not only give you that number and they say, okay, there were 1,000 murders in North Carolina. Okay, so then they break the number up per 100,000 of the population. So if there were 1,000 murders in North Carolina and 2,000 murders in California, you might say, wow, there's a lot more murders in California. It's a more dangerous place. But if I told you that California's population is 50 million and North Carolina's population is 10 million, then on a rate per 100,000, okay, California would have a lower murder rate than North Carolina. More raw murders simply because there's more people. So by presenting it as a per 100,000 in the population, we can analyze this not only between different areas with different populations, so city versus rural, North Carolina versus California, but we can do it in different times. So we can compare, well, what's North Carolina's murder rate today in 2021 or 2022 versus what was it in 1932 or 1952 or 1962, and we can see rates going up and down. So here are your Part 1 offenses. Here are the ones that almost everybody focuses on as we look at this, because sometimes you hear these called street crimes or violent crimes. These are the ones that people get very concerned about. Legitimately so. I'm not being critical of that. So we've got murder, what's often called homicide, rape or sexual assault, same category. We'll talk about that in 1 second. Robbery, aggravated assault, which just means serious assault. Sometimes, for example, in North Carolina, assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury. Burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Those are the big ones. Those are the Part 1s that almost everybody studies, in part because the numbers are more manageable. We're a little bit more comfortable with the rates. There are problems with the UCR. The first problem is some crime doesn't get reported. So it's often the case for, say, a minor crime, although there's others, if someone stole a pen that you had, you wouldn't call the police and say, hey, someone swiped my pen. The police would say, really? You want us to take a report on that? Yeah, nobody does that. And there can be darker reasons, too, why things aren't reported. Suppose a family member committed a crime. Suppose you had a family member who was mentally ill, and they committed an assault on their parent. They beat their parent, or they hurt their parent, or they stabbed their parent. Well, it's certainly possible that the family would say, well, we don't want to report this to the police. There was an assault, but we don't want it to go forward because it's going to be bad for everybody concerned. And of course, there can be much more questionable things like sometimes sexual assaults occur in families, and families say, well, we don't want to report this because we don't want to ruin someone's life about it, even though there's a sexual assault. The crimes that occur but don't get reported are what we call the dark figure of crime, unreported crime that occurs. And it's very difficult to get a handle on this. There's a couple ways we do it, but there's a very difficult. One of the other problems with the UCR, besides the dark figure crime, is what is a crime varies by state. So let's use North Carolina as an example. And just be aware I'm going to use some language here. I'm going to try to use it in a very legalistic, almost clinical sense, but be aware that you do have to use language that some people might find offensive. If you look at the definition of rape in North Carolina, rape in North Carolina has a very specific definition. In order for rape to occur, first degree rape, second degree rape being the two primary ones we're concerned with, there has to be a penis and there has to be a vagina. If a penis does not penetrate, contact the vagina, it is not called a rape in North Carolina. Now, it is a crime. I don't want to leave you the impression that, oh, if someone is orally assaulted, if someone is anally assaulted, that's not a crime in North Carolina. It is. We have a nearly identical crime with identical penalties, but we don't call it rape. So we have first degree rape and we have first degree sexual assault. I mention this because, particularly early on with the UCR, they just wanted states to report rape rates. So let's suppose you took a state, and I'm going to make this up, like Wyoming, that had a more inclusive definition of rape. Wyoming's definition of rape might say, we don't care whether it is oral, anal, or vaginal, it's rape. North Carolina says, no, rape's only vaginal. If you were trying to compare the rates between Wyoming and North Carolina, per 100,000, again remember, Wyoming would show a higher incident of rape because it's including its sexual assaults and North Carolina isn't. Now we can also talk about clearance and solved. Solved means there's going to be an arrest, but often a case is cleared where the police know or claim to know what the problem is, and they simply say, we're going to close this case. Police departments can know who commits a crime and mark it cleared but not make arrest. This can be used to keep their rates of cleared cases high even if there's no arrest. And here's some specific data I found. In Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, excuse me, right here, in 2016 there were 270 rape cases opened. 14% of those were solved by an arrest, but 19%, or about 50 cases, were cleared by what we call exceptional means. They said, well, we know who did it, but we're not going to have an arrest. So, and of course, the other thing to take away from that is, right, of the total number of rapes that occurred, only about 33, or a third of all rapes that occurred, get solved. So, there are all alternatives to this. The big alternative is let's fix the UCR. And starting in 1989, we began to supplement the UCR with what's called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, although everybody still calls it the UCR data. And one of the things it did is it started to ask for more information. Hey, don't just tell us the report of that there was a murder. Tell us what was the age, what was the gender, what was the race of the offender if you caught him, and the victim. The other thing we did was we started to do massive surveys, the National Crimes Victim Survey, which is conducted by the Department of Justice as well. This is a huge statistical survey that's done. And what it's trying to do really is to find this dark figure of crime. It actually calls people up or interviews people and says, okay, were you the victim of crime? And you might say, yeah, I was in Wake Tech, or I was in class and my pen was stolen. And that would show up. And that means, of course, that you are going to detect crimes that occurred even if they weren't reported. This becomes much more subjective because you might say, well, yeah, my friend lent me a pen and then he came and got it back, so he stole it from me. Well, it was his pen. But you're going to report that in your victim survey as a stolen object. So we do have to be a little bit careful about surveys because there can be all sorts of problems with measurements if you're being charged. If you're being asked, have you ever smoked dope? Have you ever used heroin? Have you ever sold drugs? And if you get asked that question and you're at all worried, you might say no, even if the truth is yes. There's those rape clearance rates. All right, victims of crime in context. One of the things that we do is we have classes on victimology. And we tend to think of victims as very passive. We tend to think that a victim simply exists as just a target. But in fact, particularly early when the criminal justice system is being set up, victims are very central to this. And we're slowly, I would say, but definitely moving towards putting them back towards the center. To say, well, we're not as interested in what the offender wants, we're not as interested in what the DA wants or the police want. What does the victim want out of all this? So increasingly, because there's going to be more victims than there are perpetrators, and more victims than cops, and more victims than DAs, and since we live in a democracy, to some extent, republic, the victim can make his voice or her voice heard. So we can have things like being informed of what's going on. Hey, we've made an arrest or we haven't made an arrest. Being present at trial in important decisions. Hey, we've decided to change this from a first-degree burglary to a breaking and entering in return for a plea bargain. Or the right to be heard at trial or at sentencing, the right to testify, to let your voice. And these can be important both in the criminal justice context, but also in kind of closure for the victim. If you have a victim of a violent act, there is at least some psychological evidence, sociological evidence to show that if you involve the victim in this, it's easier for them to move past it, to heal from this. Now, we do have to look at the risk of victimization. So there's what's called the routine activity theory that says to have a crime, first of all, you need a likely offender, someone who's going to commit the crime. Let's suppose you've got a crime like someone who steals cars. Well, if you've got someone who can't physically steal a car, who's a 5-year-old or a 95-year-old, then you don't have a likely offender. You're not going to have a lot of auto theft inside non-ambulatory nursing homes. So first you need someone who could commit the crime. Then you need a suitable target. Now, again, this is your victim. That language, I'm not wild about it, but the idea is, okay, you've got someone, or let's go back to our car analogy, you've got a car that can be stolen. Then you need the absence of protection or guardian, either the individual who might prohibit the crime or some way, like, is the car locked? Now, what we have learned as we've studied victims is that there is a cycle of people becoming victims over and over and over again. And often victims and offenders have connections. I guess we're probably frightened, and it's a little subjective, I guess we're probably frightened with the idea of anonymous crime, of a stranger coming and beating us up, killing us, raping us. That's a frightening application. But very often, you know the person. It is not a stranger coming into your life. It's someone that's already in your life who's doing something. And you can see this most clearly in things like domestic violence. But even in Chicago gun violence, a recent study, 70% of victims also had some offense or were offenders as well in some way. Maybe they had an illegal gun. Maybe they were dealing drugs. So victims, I guess in some ways, society likes to view them as completely innocent. And certainly there are people who, through no fault of their own, become victims. I don't want to minimize in any sense that there are not people out there who are completely innocent. But there's also degrees, because things are complex. There are also degrees in which you can say this person is at least partially responsible or bears some involvement in the crime. Yes, you were shot, but you were buying drugs. Yes, you were beaten up, but you were practicing prostitution. It doesn't excuse the person who shot or the person who beat up the person, but it gives you an explanation as to how the crime occurs. All right, perception and reality of crime trends. You do know, because I started the first lections, that crime rates are down. So there have been searches for reasons, and here are some popular ones that you often hear bandied about. One, crime rates have fallen because we lock more people up, and if you catch them, they're not out committing crime. Well, this is great. This is an attractive, seemingly rational explanation. It doesn't seem to have a very strong basis once you start to study it. And we're not going to go too far into this. We're going to get to corrections a little bit later, but suffice it to say that this is only going to be true if you catch repeat offenders and you catch them fairly early in their career. So ironically, if you believe in things like aging out, where you know that most people stop committing crimes as they get older, long-term prison terms would not lower crime necessarily. Better law enforcement. Now, this is the idea that as the police get better and better at their jobs, the crime rate will go down. Some part of this may be true, but the big thing is we're not actually solving more crimes. If you look at homicide rates in the 1960s, which are pretty high, and you look at how many of the homicides were solved, and then you compare them to today, what you're going to see is not only has the number of homicides fallen between, say, 1970 and 2020, in the last 50 years, but the percentage of cases solved has dropped. So better law enforcement is not a great explanation. Aging population, this one works a little bit better. We do know that crime is a young man's game, and I use that term fairly specific there. It's committed by men, it's committed by young men. If you have a population that has a lot of young men in it, then you're going to have a higher crime rate. If you have a population that doesn't have a lot of young men in it, your crime rate will fall. Now, one of the fascinating verifications of this was that in the United States between about 1942 and 1945, the crime rate fell. Well, there was a good reason, because most young men, 10 or 12 million of them at least, were brought into the services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and sent overseas. So, of course, crime rates might go down. Also, we have seen declines in prosecution for drugs in the United States. And this might, although it's still frequently charged, this might have caused it. Here's a breakdown for roughly the last 30 years of the crime rate. And you'll notice that peaking about 1991, 92, which is, by the way, we talked about long-term prison, about 10 or so years after the Get Tough approach to crime. So there's a big lag there if actual incarceration works. We begin to see a decrease in crime. And if we look at the number here, almost peaking at 800 per 100,000 of the population. So let's say 750, roughly, 760. And then it falls all the way down here to below 400, or let's say 350. So the violent crime rate in the United States falls 50%. This is an amazing achievement. But this is not how people view crime. If we look at the dark figure of crime, now I had a lot of charts here, and I'm sorry I squeezed them all into one page, but we've got aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle, robbery. These are all Part 1 offenses. You really can't compare murder for dark figure because the National Crime Victim Survey doesn't track murder. After all, you can't call someone up in a survey and say, hey, were you the victim of murder? This gap between the dotted line and the solid line is the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. These are reported crimes, these are surveyed crimes, and you'll notice for all of them, it's been going down. And what this seems to say is that we're getting a handle on either crimes are getting reported better, or there's fewer and fewer crimes that don't get reported or detected. Now, of course, what the public believes is something different, because there's a gap here. It's not a dark figure of crime, it's an imaginary figure of crime. Here is the North Carolina violent crime rate, okay? You can see, not North Carolina, National Crime Victim Survey. You see it's about 80 up here. Don't worry about those numbers. And you see it's down about 20 here. That's pretty dramatic because this is going to include more than this, than just some of the other ones I would exclude murder. But here's percentage of Americans believe crime is going up. We understood back in the early 90s that crime was going down, but right around 1999, about the year 2000, there begins to develop this gap between public perception and what's true. All right, so what are some alternative explanations? Now, I throw these out not because I think these are right necessarily in a certain sense, that it's the complete explanation. A couple of these I picked intentionally because they're controversial. They're going to lead you, if you're interested, to say, well, I just don't accept this. And I think it's wrong. Great. I want you to challenge these ideas or other ideas. Or maybe you've got something that should be as an alternative explanation and I didn't put it here. Because there was dozens I could have put here. So here are some alternative explanations. Legalized abortion. This is a contentious one. I led with this one because America has a real split between what is called pro-choice, pro-life. You can argue and use statistics that as abortion becomes more frequent, as there are fewer unwanted, and because unwanted children are often abused, and fewer abused children, that your crime rate will fall. That would be something I think that if you're interested, you could go out and you could find evidence for and against that. And then you'd have to really evaluate, okay, is this good evidence for or bad evidence for? Demographic decline of young adults, fewer adults in the population. I threw this in because that's one I think that if you went out and looked for evidence, you're going to find it. And it's going to be hard not to ascribe at least some of the decline in crime to a declining number of young adults in the population. Now here's one that is somewhat surprising, but again, I threw it in there because I was looking for things that were either controversial or outside of the way most people think. Environmental improvements. We know that the exposure to certain chemicals, lead being the most famous, will increase rates of violence. You expose young growing humans to high rates of lead and you're going to have more violent people. Not everybody that ingests lead is going to get violent. I am not saying that. One of the things we started to do in the 1960s was remove lead from the environment. Lead in gasoline, lead in paints, lead in a lot of things we're producing. Now, if you stop doing this, let's pick an arbitrary number, say 1970, you stop selling leaded gasoline. You didn't see crime fall in 1970, right? So you could say, well, I'm looking at the data, Mr. Chapman, and crime's not falling. Yeah, but think about this for a second. Remember I said that you're exposing young adults to lead. First of all, it's going to take a while for that lead to get out of the environment, to be sequestered in some way, stored inside the environment, outside of exposure. Second, it's going to take a while for people to grow up who haven't been exposed to the lead. So what you would expect to see if lead caused the problems is about, because the onset of crime is late teens, early 20s, let's just make it simple, 20 years old, you would expect that about 20 years after the banning of lead, as lead starts to be removed and you have a generation of people that might be criminals grow up to the age where you have the onset of crime, you'd see a decline in crime. And interestingly enough, at least in some studies, that's what we see. Rise of income. If you believe, and some people do, that crime is caused by money, if more people have money, there's less of a need to commit crimes to get it. Now, if at the simplest level, if I'm hungry and I need to steal a loaf of bread, then bread theft in society is going to be high when there's a lot of poor people that are hungry. If everybody has enough to eat, bread theft is going to be almost unknown, except in a few instances. So you could argue that as we've become wealthier, and we are a wealthier society today than we are in the past, fewer poor people, there should be lower crime. And certainly for some crimes that's true. Now, interestingly enough, if you think about white-collar crimes, you might have the reverse of this. I didn't include that, but you should think that, okay, as there's more people in a position to steal with a pen than with a gun, there should be more theft by pen. Here's one I threw in at the end as I was looking at numbers of immigrants commit crime, because there's been a lot of stuff in the news about immigrants coming to the United States, okay, and how it's going to hurt America in some ways. We've studied immigration and immigration crime rates. Do immigrants who come to the United States commit crimes? And what we know is that immigrants coming into the United States commit fewer crimes than native-born Americans. So as there's more immigrants as a percentage of your society, then your crime rate falls. All right. Crime, race, and poverty. A few other things to talk about. Not all groups have seen the same decline in crime. Racial minorities have seen sharp increases in crimes and arrests as compared to whites. Now, it's been falling for everybody. But for example, one of the statistics I saw recently was that African Americans in North Carolina are 3 times as likely to be arrested for simple possession of marijuana as whites are. Now, trust me, there's not 3 times as many African Americans in North Carolina as whites. So you have to ask the question, why is this happening? Another case, and this is one, it's harder to study, but I included a link to an FBI report, a UCR report there, about wealth in crime. And then ethnicity in crime, because we start to get into real slippery areas about defining, okay, you see some charts. I was looking at one today, for example, that was measuring black and white crime. And then it had a really interesting parentheses around the term white, and it said including white Hispanics. And then around black it said including black Hispanics. So there it just looked at black and white. It didn't put Hispanic into the mix. So when you study it, it's very difficult to measure ethnicity. It's difficult to measure race, to be honest about it. It's difficult to measure class. Ethnicity is even stickier in some regards. Are you ethnically Hispanic because your parents came from someplace that was identified as Hispanic or Latino? If you came from a country like Mexico, are you Hispanic? Well, the example I use in class is that Mitt Romney, who, if you've ever seen a picture of him, looks whiter than Wonder Bread. Okay, I believe it's his grandparents were Mormons who went to Mexico, and if I'm not mistaken, his father or his grandfather was born in Mexico. Does that make Mitt Romney, the senator from Utah, Hispanic? And I would say the answer there is probably not. But if it's just where your relatives come from, then yes. So also the criminalization of some acts and not others preserves the current social and economic system. One of the examples I often use in class is that the Great Experiment from about 1919 to about 1929, 1930, which is Prohibition, where we banned alcohol. You can look at this as a very much an ethnic, I would say an ethnic mechanism of the control. Typically those on the bottom in the 1919, 1920s were far more likely to drink. And some of that was what they drank, how they drank, where they drank. So people have argued, and I think this is again something that if you're interested in, you can go out and look at, that prohibition was not just about the harm that alcohol caused. It was also the idea that this was reactions against Catholics, because there was quite a bit of prejudice against Catholics in the United States. The Irish Catholics hung out in saloons and pubs. The German Catholics hung out in beer gardens, Berchtesgadens gardens. The Italian and Spanish Catholics hung out in cafes. When you banned those places, you broke up where they met. You broke up and really attacked what some white Protestant Americans saw as really a threat to their political power. I am not saying I am not saying that Prohibition was a conspiracy by white Protestants. I'm saying that there was a component. There was some of this that was based on the idea of ethnicity being an issue in Prohibition. Women in crime. Um, Well, rates for men committing crime have fallen. The number of women who are committing it compared to men has gone up some. It's still mostly drug offenses, alcohol offenses, property crimes. We do know that victims are more likely to be women. They're more overrepresented than men. A lot of this has roots in, I think, the physiology of and psychology, but one of the roots is physiology, that men are capable of beating up women. So why are women assaulted by men more than men assaulted by women? And women do assault men. There is female to male domestic violence, for example. Well, some of it is just physiologically men can do this. Um, we're going to close off talking about mental illness and crime. About 11%, 10% of the population have some level of mental illness. And this ranges dramatically. We're talking about all sorts of things. You can be talking about mental illness. The most common mental illness in the United States is clinical depression, which is not being sad. It's an actual mental state. Having said that, only 4% of violent crime is committed by people who are mentally ill, which means that if 10% of the population has mental illness, but they're only committing 4% of the crime, they're actually underrepresented as criminals. Okay? The most significant issue is drug abuse, followed by schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. Those are the ones that we tend to see. Risk factors, one of the things is, if they're not more likely to be the perpetrators, they are more likely, 140% more likely to be victims. So if we go back to that victimization triangle, you're going to have a perpetrator, you're going to have a victim, and you're going to have the opportunity. Being mentally ill makes you more probable that you're a victim. Mental illness remains in our society, but where we hold them has changed. This is a chart I include because, again, I want to challenge you to think about it. And this is one of those instances where you're going to hear a professor or a teacher say, back when I was young. But here you go. Back when I was young, if you'll look at this chart, you'll see that the combined rate of people in mental hospitals and in prisons. So you can follow this along. You see how it goes down and goes up. Well, that's going to be the combination of these two lines. We had a lot of people in the United States, almost twice as many people, 3 times as many people, in mental hospitals as opposed to in prisons. So what we did is we started shutting the mental hospitals down in the 1960s. So we had places that had large numbers of beds where we housed people that had mental illness. And the theory very often was we were going to treat them in the community. We're going to return the mentally ill to the community. We're going to stop locking them up. There were very noble reasons for this. There were also less than noble reasons for this. So they were deinstitutionalized. And the number of people that were in mental hospitals went from 600,000, and you can see now that it's way, 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 way down. It's 90+% down. But, okay, you notice that those people had to go somewhere. They didn't go to mental health facilities. They went to prison and jail. So we dumped on the poor cops and on our poor correction system. You handle the mentally ill now. We're not going to handle them in mental institutions. We're going to handle them inside the criminal justice system. And this, to some extent, led to more people being locked up. Okay. On that kind of sad note, when you're ready, you can click on Chapter 4. Till then, have a good day, have a good afternoon, have a good evening.